The storm began hours before Queen Mariah's labor. It was as though the heavens themselves were marking the event with fury and dread. Lightning flashed, illuminating the royal palace in brief bursts of brilliance, and thunder rolled, shaking the very walls. Servants hurried about, their faces taut with worry. The queen's cries echoed through the stone corridors as midwives and healers surrounded her bed. "Push, your majesty!" urged the head midwife, her voice strained. It had been nearly a day since the queen's labor began, and whispers of ill omens were already spreading through the palace. Some servants prayed silently, fearing what the prolonged labor might signify. Finally, as the queen let out a final anguished scream, the room was filled with the sharp, shrill cry of a newborn. The midwife sighed with relief and began cleaning the baby, but as the child was placed into his mother's arms, a gasp rippled through the room. "His eyes!" one of the midwives whispered, stepping back in alarm. Queen Mariah looked down at her son. His eyes, wide open and full of life, were the color of the summer sky, a piercing blue that seemed to glow in the dim light of the chamber. "Blue eyes," murmured the head midwife, crossing herself. "A sign of the gods." The queen's joy faltered. In Assyria, blue eyes were not celebrated. They were feared, believed to be a mark of divine interference, a curse, or a harbinger of calamity. "Fetch the king," she whispered, cradling her son closer. "Now." When King Azika entered the chamber, his expression hardened as he looked at his son. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as though the gods were watching. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The midwives fell silent, their gazes fixed on the floor. It was the head midwife who finally spoke. "His eyes, my lord, they are unnatural. The priests must be consulted." The king stared at the infant, his heart torn. He had long prayed for a son to carry on his legacy, but the superstitions of his people weighed heavily on him. "Summon Orukama," he said grimly. "Now." Orukama entered the chamber with the air of someone accustomed to wielding power. The chief priest's robes, adorned with sacred symbols, swept the floor as he approached the queen's bedside. His face was painted with intricate designs meant to commune with the gods, and his staff, carved from sacred wood, clicked against the stone floor with each step. He took one look at the child and recoiled. This is no ordinary child," he hissed. Queen Mariah clutched her son tighter, her maternal instincts flaring. "He is my son, nothing more, nothing less." Orukama ignored her, raising his staff and chanting in a low, guttural tone. The air in the room grew heavy, as though the very gods were listening. Finally, he lowered his staff and turned to the king. "This child is cursed," he declared. "His eyes foretell calamity. The gods demand he be cast into the evil forest, or ruin shall befall our kingdom." The queen gasped. "You cannot mean that. He is just a baby." The king's face was ashen. "There must be another way." Orukama shook his head. "Defy the gods, and you will doom us all. The choice is yours, your majesty." That night, the king called a council of elders. The debate was heated, but fear won out over compassion. By dawn, the decision was made. The child would be abandoned in the evil forest. The queen's cries echoed through the palace as soldiers carried her son away. Wrapped in soft linens, the baby was silent, as though he knew his fate. The queen chased after the soldiers, begging them to spare her child, but the king held her back. "It is for the kingdom," he said, his voice breaking. "We have no choice." The soldiers entered the forest with heavy hearts. The evil forest was a place of legends, filled with spirits and creatures that preyed on the living. No one who entered willingly ever returned. They left the baby on a patch of moss, whispering prayers for his soul before fleeing. As the sun rose, the forest came alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of animals, and then the soft sound of footsteps. Obadel, an old herbalist, wandered the forest in search of rare herbs. When he heard the faint cries of a baby, he followed the sound, his heart racing. What he found shocked him: a tiny infant, abandoned but alive. The baby opened his eyes, and Obadel froze. Blue eyes. The stories flooded his mind, tales of curses and omens. But then the baby reached out, his tiny hand brushing Obadel's. "You were meant to die here," the old man murmured, "but perhaps the gods have other plans." Obadel walked briskly through the forest, cradling the infant close to his chest. The boy was warm and calm now, his earlier cries replaced by soft coos as he clung to his rescuer's tunic. The path back to the village was familiar to Obadel, yet the weight of what he carried made each step feel heavier. The thought gnawed at him. What would the villagers say? Even before setting eyes on the baby's unusual eyes, they would question why he had brought a child from the evil forest, a place of curses and spirits. Obadiah had spent his life tending to the sick and wounded, earning the villagers' respect, but this would test their faith in him. When he finally emerged from the forest and stepped onto the dirt path leading to his hut, the first rays of dawn illuminated the village. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys of the small thatched houses, and the air smelled of cooking fires and morning dew. He slipped into his hut, closing the door behind him. His modest home was filled with shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and powders, a testament to his life's work as a healer. Gently he laid the baby on a bed of soft cloth, murmuring words of comfort. "Rest now, little one," he whispered. "You are safe here." But as the sun climbed higher, the village stirred, and Obadiah's secret did not remain hidden for long. By midday, a small crowd had gathered outside Obadiah's hut, their voices raised in a mix of curiosity and fear. The news had spread like wildfire. Obadiah had brought back a child from the evil forest. "It's unnatural," muttered Iabo, the village elder's wife, her face lined with worry. "No good can come from this." "What was he thinking?" added Ikun, a hunter known for his fiery temper. "Does he want to bring the gods' wrath upon us?" The door to the hut creaked open, and Obadiah stepped out, his calm demeanor doing little to quell the murmurs. In his arms the baby stirred, his blue eyes blinking against the light. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "Blue eyes," Yabo exclaimed, crossing herself. "It's true!" Ikon stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his machete. "Obadiah," he said sharply, "you know what this means. That child is a curse. You must send him away before it's too late." The crowd murmured in agreement, their fear growing with each passing moment. But Obadiah held his ground, his voice firm as he addressed them. "This child is no curse," he said. "I found him abandoned in the forest, left to die. Would you have me turn my back on him as well? Is that what the gods would want?" The villagers hesitated, their fear clashing with their respect for Obadiah. He had healed their wounds, saved their children from fever, and guided them through countless hardships. Could they truly turn against him now? "The gods are just," Obadiah said. "If this child were truly cursed, he would not have survived in the evil forest. The spirits would have claimed him. But he is here, alive and well. That is no curse. It is a blessing." His words hung in the air, and slowly the tension began to dissipate. Though many still harbored doubts, the villagers left one by one, leaving Obadiah and the baby in peace. But not everyone was convinced. Ikun lingered near the edge of the crowd, his expression dark. "You're a fool, old man," he muttered under his breath. "That boy will bring nothing but trouble." The years passed, and Ayomide grew into a bright and curious child. He was quick to learn, often watching Obadiah with wide eyes as the old herbalist prepared remedies and treated the sick. "Why do you mix these leaves with water?" Ayomide asked one day, his small hands reaching for a mortar and pestle. "To draw out their healing properties," Obadiah replied with a smile. "But it's not just about the herbs. Healing is about understanding the person, listening to their pain, and knowing how to ease it." Ayomide nodded solemnly, his blue eyes thoughtful. Though many villagers still regarded him with caution, his kindness and gentle nature began to win them over. He would help carry water for the women, fetch firewood for the elders, and comfort crying children. But it was his gift for healing that truly set him apart. One afternoon, a young boy named Oho stumbled into Obadiah's hut, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His mother followed close behind, her voice trembling with panic. "Obadiah, please help him," she pleaded. "He was bitten by a snake while playing near the river." Obadiah knelt beside the boy, examining the wound on his leg. The flesh around the bite was swollen and dark, and the boy's breathing was shallow. Before Obadiah could reach for his herbs, Ayomide stepped forward. He placed his small hands on the boy's forehead and closed his eyes, his expression serene. "It's not just the bite," Ayomide said softly. "The venom is spreading, but it's also poisoning his blood. You'll need more than herbs." Obadel stared at the boy in astonishment. How do you know this? I just feel it, Iomid replied, his voice hesitant. Obadel didn't question him further. Together, they worked to save Oho, combining traditional remedies with techniques Iomide suggested. By nightfall, the boy's fever had broken and the swelling had begun to recede. Word of Iomide's abilities spread quickly. People began to travel from other villages seeking his help. Though many still whispered about his blue eyes, they could not deny his skill or his compassion. The village was quiet in the late afternoon sun, the usual hum of activity muted by the oppressive heat of the day. Iomide, now 10 years old, sat cross-legged outside Obadil's hut, carefully sorting dried leaves into neat piles. He hummed softly to himself, mimicking the rhythm of the drums that often played during village festivals. "Baba," he called out as the old man emerged from the hut, "these ones are bitter leaf, but they don't look fresh enough to use." Obadil leaned over, inspecting the leaves with a critical eye. "You're learning well, Iomide," he said with a smile. "You have an eye for details most adults miss." Before Iomide could respond, a commotion erupted at the far end of the village. 2 men hurried toward them, supporting a third man whose head lolled weakly. His face was ashen, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. "Help him!" one of the men called out. "He collapsed near the river!" Obadel and Iomide rushed to meet them, guiding the unconscious man into the hut. Iomide's heart raced as he helped the others lay the man on a straw mat. His skin was burning hot to the touch, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. "What happened to him?" Obadil asked, already reaching for his bag of herbs. "We don't know," one of the men replied, his voice trembling. "He was a traveler passing through. He said he was heading to Assyria, but he barely spoke before he collapsed." Obadil began examining the man, checking his pulse and inspecting his eyes. "This fever is severe," he said grimly. "If we don't act quickly, he may not survive." Iomide knelt beside the man, his small hands hovering just above his chest. He closed his eyes, focusing on the man's labored breaths and the faint, erratic rhythm of his heartbeat. He felt a strange, intuitive pull, as though the man's illness was speaking to him in whispers only he could hear. "It's not just the fever," Iomide said suddenly. "It's his blood. It's poisoned." Obadel looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "There's something inside him," Iomide explained, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "It's in his stomach, spreading through his body. We need to cleanse it." Obadel studied Iomide for a moment, then nodded. He had learned to trust the boy's instincts, no matter how unusual they seemed. "Fetch me the bitter cola and the baobab bark," Obadel instructed, "and heat some water over the fire." Iomide moved quickly, retrieving the necessary herbs and preparing a bitter tea, as Obadel directed. Together, they worked in seamless coordination, their hands steady as they administered the remedy to the stranger. For hours, they monitored the man, wiping his brow with cool cloths and adjusting his position to ease his breathing. Iomide refused to leave his side, his young face etched with determination. As the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the hut's walls, the man stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and he let out a weak but audible groan. "He's awake!" Iomide exclaimed, relief flooding his voice. The stranger looked around, his gaze finally settling on Iomide. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You saved my life." Obadil placed a hand on Iomide's shoulder, his expression a mix of pride and wonder. "It wasn't just me," he said. "This boy has a gift." The villagers who had gathered outside the hut erupted in cheers when they heard the news. From that day, Iomide's reputation as a healer grew, spreading beyond the village to neighboring communities. Meanwhile, in Assyria, the kingdom was crumbling. A mysterious plague had swept through the land, leaving death and despair in its wake. Entire villages were abandoned, their inhabitants either dead or too sick to stay. King Azaka paced the throne room, his face lined with worry. "How much longer can this go on?" he demanded of his advisors. "The people are dying, and we are no closer to finding a cure." "We have sent emissaries to every known healer," one advisor replied, "but none have succeeded." Queen Maria, seated beside the king, looked out the window, her thoughts far away. Though 2 decades had passed since she had lost her son, the pain of that night still haunted her. And now, With the kingdom on the brink of ruin, she could not help but wonder if the gods were punishing them for what they had done. "There must be someone," she said softly, "someone who can help." A messenger arrived that evening, breathless and covered in dust. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing low, "there is a healer, a young man in the village of If. They say his skill is unmatched and that he has never failed to cure an ailment." The king's interest was piqued. "Send for him immediately," he commanded. And so Iomede's journey to his past began. The messenger's news spread through the royal court like wildfire. The promise of hope, of a healer capable of saving the kingdom, ignited a spark among the people who had grown weary of despair. Yet, in the depths of the palace, the queen could not quell the unease that gripped her heart. Late that night, as the king sat brooding over maps and reports of the spreading plague, Queen Maria approached him. Her voice was soft but firm, cutting through the stillness of the chamber. "Azika," she said, standing by his side, "this healer, do you believe he can succeed where others have failed?" The king looked up at her, his eyes weary. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we have no choice but to try. If this healer can save our people, I will give him anything he desires." Maria hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. What if the gods have already sent us a sign, and we ignored it? Azika's gaze hardened. He knew what she was implying. It was a subject they had not spoken of in years, an open wound that refused to heal. "Maria," he said, his voice low, "we made the only choice we could. There is no point in revisiting the past." "But what if we were wrong?" she whispered. "What if this plague is a punishment for what we did?" The king stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough," he said sharply. "We cannot undo the past. All we can do is focus on saving the future. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must prepare for this healer's arrival." Maria watched him leave, her heart heavy. She turned to the window, gazing out at the darkened horizon. In her heart, she prayed that the healer would bring salvation, not just for the kingdom, but for the ghosts of their past. Iomede sat quietly in the corner of Obadel's hut, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden floor as he listened to the messenger's words. The man spoke of a kingdom in crisis, of a plague that had devastated the land and left the royal family desperate for help. "They say you are the only one who can save them," the messenger said, his tone almost reverent. Obadel leaned against the wall, his arms crossed as he studied Iomede's face. "What do you think, my son?" Iomede looked up, his blue eyes thoughtful. "If the people are suffering and I can help them, then I must go," he said simply. Obadel nodded, pride and sorrow mingling in his expression. "The road to Assyria will not be easy," he warned. "You will face suspicion, fear, and perhaps even hostility. But if this is your path, then you must walk it with courage." The next morning, Iomede packed his satchel with herbs and tools, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he might not return for a long time. The villagers gathered to see him off, their faces a mix of gratitude and sadness. "Be safe," said Iyabo, pressing a small pouch of dried fruits into his hand. "And remember, we are proud of you." Ekin, who had long been wary of Aomid, stood at the back of the crowd, his expression unreadable. As Aomid passed him, Ekin finally spoke. "You've proven me wrong before," he said gruffly. "Don't make me regret trusting you now." Iomide smiled faintly. "I'll do my best." The journey to Assyria was long and arduous. Iomide and the messenger traveled through dense forests, over rocky hills, and across wide rivers. Along the way, Iomide encountered people suffering from the same mysterious illness that plagued the kingdom. He stopped to help wherever he could, his remedies providing temporary relief, but no cure. When they finally reached the gates of Assyria, Iomede was struck by the sight before him. The once thriving city was a shadow of its former self. The streets were eerily quiet, and the few people they passed were gaunt and pale, their faces etched with despair. The palace, however, still stood tall and imposing, its golden spires gleaming in the sunlight. Iomede felt a strange pull as he approached, a sense of familiarity he could not explain. The throne room was grand and intimidating, with high ceilings and walls adorned with intricate carvings. Iomede stepped inside, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. At the far end of the room, King Azeka and Queen Maria sat side by side, their expressions carefully guarded. Iomide bowed deeply. "Your Majesties," he said, his voice steady, "I am Iomide, a healer from the village of Ife. I have come to offer my help." The queen's breath caught as she studied the young man. His blue eyes were unmistakable, and yet she dared not voice her thoughts. The king, however, regarded Aomid with a mix of skepticism and hope. "We have heard much about your abilities," Azika said. "If you can save my people, you will be rewarded beyond measure. But be warned, others have tried and failed. This plague is unlike anything we have ever seen." Ayomide nodded. "I will do my best, Your Majesty, but I ask for one thing in return." The king raised an eyebrow. "What is it you desire?" "Nothing for myself," Ayomide replied. "Only that the people I treat are cared for properly, and that I am given the freedom to do what is necessary." Azika hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. You have my permission to begin immediately." As Ayomide worked in the palace infirmary, treating the sick and studying the symptoms of the plague, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The queen lingered near the door, her gaze fixed on him as though she were searching for something. One evening, as Ayomide prepared his remedies, Maria approached him. "Where did you learn to heal?" she asked softly. "My father taught me," Ayomide said, glancing at her. "He's a herbalist in If. And your mother?" "I never knew her," he admitted. "I was told I was found abandoned in the forest as a baby." Maria's hand trembled, and she quickly hid it behind her back. "Thank you," she said hurriedly, retreating before he could see the tears in her eyes. Queen Maria paced her chambers that night, her mind racing. Every word Ayomide had spoken echoed in her ears. A child abandoned in the forest, blue eyes as striking as the skies of dawn. She clenched her fists, her thoughts drawn inexorably to the night she had last seen her son. She had long since accepted that he was gone, the ache in her heart, a constant reminder of the sacrifice she had been forced to make. Yet here stood this healer, a young man whose eyes and gentle demeanor stirred memories she had tried desperately to suppress. The queen pulled a wooden box from the back of a cabinet, her hands trembling. Inside were tokens of her lost son, a small blanket embroidered with his name, Iodel, and a bracelet of woven grass she had made for him during her pregnancy. Holding these relics, she felt her resolve strengthen. "I must know the truth," she whispered. The next morning, Queen Maria approached the king with caution. He sat at the head of the long dining table, his face as stern as ever, reviewing reports from his advisors. "Azika," she said softly, waiting until the servants had left the room, "there is something I must speak to you about." The king glanced up, his expression impatient. "What is it, Maria? The kingdom is in crisis, and I do not have time for speculation." "It's about Ayomide," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Have you looked at him, truly looked at him?" Azeka frowned, setting down his reports. "What are you implying?" "I believe," she hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down on her. "I believe he may be our son." The king's expression darkened, his hand slamming down on the table. "Do not speak of such things," he snapped. "Our son is dead. Orukama himself decreed it." "Orukama lied," Maria interrupted, her voice rising. "I feel it, Azeka. I see it in his eyes. And he said he was found in the evil forest as a child. How many abandoned children could there possibly be?" Azeka stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is madness. You are letting grief cloud your judgment. Even if this healer resembles our son, it does not mean he is him." Maria stepped closer, her voice firm. "Then let me prove it. Allow me to speak with him. If I am wrong, I will say no more. But if I am right—" The king's jaw tightened, his conflict evident. Finally he sighed and nodded. "Do what you must. But do not let this distract from the task at hand. The kingdom needs him, whether he is our son or not." Ayomide was in the infirmary, grinding herbs into a fine paste when the queen approached him. Her presence startled him. She rarely entered this space, leaving him to his work. "Your Majesty," he said, setting down his mortar and pestle, "how can I assist you?" Maria hesitated, her heart pounding. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. His blue eyes, the shape of his face, even the gentle way he spoke, it all matched the son she had lost. "I need to ask you something personal," she said, her voice trembling. Ayomide tilted his head, curious. "Of course. Do you have any distinguishing marks? A birthmark, perhaps?" The question caught him off guard. "Yes," he said slowly. "I have a small crescent-shaped mark on my neck. Why do you ask?" Maria felt her knees weaken. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched his collar. May I see it? Confused but obliging, Eomid pulled back his tunic to reveal the faint crescent-shaped birthmark on the side of his neck. Maria gasped, tears streaming down her face. She stumbled back, clutching her chest as the weight of the truth hit her. It's you, she whispered. It's really you. Iomide frowned, his confusion growing. Your Majesty, what are you saying? You are my son, she said, her voice breaking. You were born in this palace 20 years ago. You were taken from me because we thought it was the only way to save the kingdom. Iomide stepped back, shaking his head. That can't be. I was raised by Obadel. He told me I was abandoned in the forest. Maria reached for his hands, holding them tightly. Because we left you there, she admitted, her guilt spilling out in sobs. The priest said you were cursed. He told us that if we didn't abandon you, the kingdom would fall. But I see now how wrong we were. The gods didn't curse you. They blessed you. Iomede's mind reeled, the room spinning around him. He had spent his entire life wondering about his origins, and now the truth was more than he could bear. I need time, he said, pulling away. I need to think. Maria nodded, tears still streaming down her face. Take all the time you need, but please know that I never stopped loving you, not for a moment. Word of Eomide's identity spread quickly through the palace, and it wasn't long before Orukama caught wind of the rumors. The old priest, now frail but still cunning, knew his time was running out. That night, he summoned a servant to his chambers. Prepare my belongings, he hissed. I must leave before the king learns the truth. But it was too late. As Orukama stepped into the courtyard, 2 guards blocked his path. Where do you think you're going? One of them demanded. Orukama's face paled. I have urgent business in the temple, he said quickly. You'll explain that to the king, the guard said, grabbing his arm. The priest was dragged before the court the next morning. The king, flanked by the queen and Iomide, stared him down with a fury that could not be contained. Orukama, Azika said, his voice cold. Tell us the truth. Did you lie about the prophecy? The priest fell to his knees, trembling. Your Majesty, Speak! The king thundered. Orukama broke down, tears streaming down his face. Yes, he confessed. I lied. The boy was not cursed. I feared his potential. I feared that he would grow to surpass me, to take away my influence in the kingdom, so I used the people's fear to justify his exile. A gasp rippled through the court. Iomide stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. You sentenced my son to die, Azeka said, his voice trembling with rage. And for what? Your pride, your greed, mercy, your majesty, Orukama pleaded. I beg you, mercy. But there was no mercy to be found. The king ordered the priest's execution, and by nightfall, Orukama's reign of deceit came to an end. The morning after Orukama's confession, the mood in the palace was somber but tinged with hope. Iomide had retreated to the palace gardens, seeking solitude among the tall, flowering trees and the soothing hum of nature. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on his mind. The revelation of his royal lineage, the queen's tearful pleas, and Orukama's betrayal had left him reeling. He sat beneath a large baobab tree, its roots sprawling like a network of veins across the earth. In his hands, he held a simple bracelet woven from dried grass, a gift from Obadel, the man who had raised him and shaped his life. The familiar texture of the bracelet grounded him, reminding him of the man he had always called father. Iomide? The queen's voice broke his reverie. He looked up to see her standing a few feet away, her expression hesitant. She wore a simple gown, her royal regalia set aside, and for a moment she looked more like a grieving mother than a queen. May I sit? She asked softly. Iomide nodded, and she lowered herself onto the grass beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The gentle rustle of leaves filled the silence between them. When I look at you, she began, her voice trembling, I see the boy I held in my arms all those years ago, the boy I was forced to let go. I see my son. Iomide swallowed hard, his throat tightening. I spent my whole life wondering who I was, he admitted. Obadela told me I was abandoned, but he never knew why. Now that I do, I'm not sure what to do with that knowledge. Maria reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. I know I can never undo the pain we caused you, she said, but please believe me when I say that not a day has gone by when I didn't pray for your safety. You may not see me as your mother, but you will always be my son." Her words stirred something deep within Ayomid. He thought of Obadiah's kindness, the villagers who had come to accept him, and the people of Assyria who now needed him. Perhaps he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. "Then let me start by helping the people," he said finally. "If I can cure this plague, maybe I can find my place here." Mariah smiled through her tears. "You've already found it, Ayomid. You found it in their hearts." Back in the infirmary, Ayomide worked tirelessly to uncover the source of the plague. He examined the symptoms of the afflicted: fever, black spots on the skin, and difficulty breathing. He noticed patterns that others had missed. The spread of the disease was concentrated near the rivers and wells. "It's in the water," he said aloud, startling the attendants who were assisting him. "The plague is being carried through the kingdom's water supply." The revelation sparked a flurry of activity. Ayomid instructed the attendants to boil all drinking water and began developing a remedy using herbs that counteracted toxins. He mixed the concoction himself, testing it on a critically ill patient. By the next morning, the patient's fever had broken, and the black spots on their skin began to fade. "It's working," Ayomida whispered, relief washing over him. Word of the breakthrough spread quickly, and soon the entire palace was abuzz with hope. Ayomid worked day and night, training the palace healers and distributing the remedy across the kingdom. Within weeks, the plague began to subside, and the people of Assyria began to heal. The court held a grand celebration to honor Ayomid's success. The great hall was adorned with banners and garlands, and the people, once weak and despairing, filled the room with laughter and song. Yet amidst the joy, Ayomid felt a quiet unease. The weight of his newfound identity still lingered, and he had yet to speak with the king. Late that evening, after the festivities had ended, Ayomid found King Azika alone in the throne room. The king sat in his gilded chair, staring into the distance, his expression unreadable. "Your Majesty," Ayomid said, bowing slightly, "may I speak with you?" Azeka looked up, his eyes heavy with emotion. "You don't need to call me that," he said quietly. "You are my son." Ayomid hesitated, then stepped closer. "I'm still trying to understand what that means," he admitted. "You abandoned me, yet here I am, standing before you. Do you regret it?" The king's shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, weary sigh. "Every moment of every day," he said. "When Orukama told us you were cursed, I was too afraid to question him. I thought I was protecting the kingdom, but all I did was destroy my family." Azika stood and approached Ayomide, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I cannot undo the past, but I can promise you this. I will spend the rest of my life making amends, if you will allow me." Ayomide studied his father's face, seeing the raw sincerity in his eyes. Slowly he nodded. "I'll try," he said, "but it will take time." "That is more than I deserve," Azeka said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you." Weeks later, the king convened the court to make a historic announcement. The great hall was packed with nobles, advisors, and villagers, all eager to hear the king's words. "My people," Azeka began, his voice steady and strong, "we have endured a great trial, but through the grace of the gods and the skill of our healer, we have prevailed. Today, I stand before you not just as your king, but as a father." He gestured to Ayomide, who stepped forward, his blue eyes gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the hall's windows. "This man, Ayomide, is my son," Azeka declared. "The boy I once thought lost to us has returned, not as a curse, but as a blessing. He has saved our kingdom, and it is only right that he be named my heir." The hall erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. Ayomide stood tall, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. For the first time, he felt truly at peace. Ayomide was crowned heir to the throne in a grand ceremony that brought together people from every corner of the kingdom. The villagers who had raised him traveled to the palace, their hearts swelling with pride as they watched the boy they had once feared ascend to greatness. Obadiah stood by Ayomide's side during the ceremony. Under Ayomide's leadership, Assyria entered a golden age. His healing abilities, combined with his compassion and wisdom, transformed the kingdom into a beacon of hope and prosperity. He introduced new systems of health and education, ensuring that no one in the kingdom would ever suffer needlessly again. Obadiah, now an honored guest at the palace, watched with pride as Ayomide embraced his role as prince and healer. "You have always been destined for greatness," he said one evening, his voice filled with warmth. Iomide smiled. I wouldn't be here without you, father. The blue-eyed prince's story became legend, a tale of redemption, resilience, and the triumph of love over fear. And so Iomede's name was etched into the annals of history, not as a cursed child, but as the savior of Assyria.
Hello, beautiful people. Thank you for your support. Thank you so much for always listening to and watching my stories. Thank you for liking. Thank you for commenting and sharing my stories. Please continue to stick with me. Keep liking, keep sharing, and continue dropping your wonderful comments. Most importantly, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It would mean a lot to me. Thank you. Hi, beautiful people. Thank you for watching Folktales by Promise. Please remember to like, share, and leave a comment below to encourage me. Also, do not forget to subscribe to my channel.